I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and this is The Radical Center, a recording project I began in 2022 as a way to describe and discuss the social and ideological currents that are rapidly altering our culture. In a time when political polarization seems to be the norm, I'm seeking to understand rather than react. I'm grateful to all the thoughtful men and women who share their stories and insights with me in this conversation series. If you would like to contribute to this project financially, there are links in the description. Thank you, and thank you all for listening and being part of this exploration. Today I'm speaking with Laura Becker, and Laura, your work has been really illuminating, I think, for me as I've learned more about trans and detrans issues. And you're an artist and also a detransitioner who's been really out about your story. And it was a couple of months ago that you posted something that I thought was really insightful about girls and porn and about the fact that we're not talking enough about how the proliferation of online pornography is affecting specifically girls, but really people in general. And that's a conversation that I've been looking forward to having with you. And it's a topic that I think is really important and really overlooked because it's uncomfortable for people to talk about for lots of reasons that are, obvious and not obvious. But it's a really sensitive subject, and I appreciate your willingness to have a dialogue about it. And if you want to maybe say a little bit about yourself for anybody who might not be familiar with your work.
Sure. So I'm a very public detransitioner, quite outspoken about my experience with transition, detransition, and then working with other detransitioners, parents, and professionals to try and stop the harms of gender medicine, the lies of transgenderism, and trying to help the survivors of this, as well as do some preventative work. So I'd consider my work to be primarily psychoeducational. I have a memoir that I'm coming out with next year, and I write and tweet a lot, which is writing as well, but it is tweeting. But yeah, I guess just I'll give us maybe a short summary of my story. I'm a Gen Z person, sadly, tragically, but I was born in 1997, so I'm 27 now. And when I was a kid, I was quite non-conforming in general. I was a tomboy. And then at 11, I was diagnosed on the autism spectrum. I was also diagnosed with an endocrine disorder, polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS. So I had a lot of hormonal dysregulation. I had social and emotional issues. And, I just had a very difficult early sort of puberty around 10 and 11. And then around then, there was a lot of familial issues. And so there ended up being parental abuse from my father, psychological, emotional, verbal abuse, and manipulation. There was emotional neglect and, complex trauma that occurred over many years. And so as a teenager, I was that classic, autistic girl online, very socially awkward, very depressed, suicidal. I was on Tumblr. I found gender ideology on Tumblr, and I got very into social justice and queerness and non-binaryism. And then that led to me having a very strong identity crisis, on top of already the low self-esteem and issues that I was having. And at 18, I came out as transgender, as a gay trans man. And at 19, I took testosterone. So I injected testosterone weekly for 7 months. And then at 20, I had my breasts removed in a gender affirming mastectomy. Although I was suicidal throughout that entire period, and I was seeking mental health care, but wasn't able to find any sort of professional or really just any safe adult that could help me navigate this. And so I thought the only way to deal with my nonconformity and my dysphoria was to medically transition. Unfortunately, that didn't help. And I spent several years in getting more traumatized from living this lie and disassociating from my body. At 22, I was finally diagnosed with PTSD. from the child abuse, from abusive relationships to men, and then from the transition itself. So I realized at 22 that I had this thing called trauma, which I didn't understand. I was taught from my father that everything was my fault. And, I had this, nihilistic sense of self. And so I didn't realize that it was actually my environment that was the problem and not me. And so I learned I had trauma. And then I started to understand that I transitioned from abuse and from trauma, and that I was never meant to be a gay man, but I was actually just a quirky straight woman. And with the help of some other women that I'd met online in the gender critical space, I sort of started to begin to heal that and got some good therapy. And so for the last 5 years, I've been having a lot of healing from all this, and then speaking out as much as I can, traveling around the country and even to a couple other countries to speak on detransition and the harms of gender medicine and trying to get some new regulations for that. So I'm pretty much an open book, which is why I'm here to talk about porn. So
Well, I really appreciate your openness and candor, and it takes a lot to be able to talk about such sensitive issues and your own your own journey that's been quite tumultuous and painful in this open way. You were trans then for 4 years, or identifying as trans for about 4 years of your life.
yeah, I was starting to identify and question if I was trans when I was about 16 or 17. And I was ruminating on it for several years. And then I kind of came out officially as trans at 18. So I'd say probably from about 15, I was non binary. And about 17 to about 22, I was trans identified.
Mm-hmm. When you were when you were going through that phase of fixation, did you feel like you would have been open to somebody challenging that, or was it really solid in your mind?
I mean, on one hand, I've always been an independent person, so kind of a rebellious type of person, stubborn. And so, on one hand, yes, I had these very strong beliefs and was very passionate about it. On the other hand, I was also completely erratic and dysfunctional and well aware that my life wasn't going well. So, I do think that if I had a healthy, safe adult who could mirror me in the
Mm-hmm.
way that I am, not just someone kind of, that I didn't relate to, but someone who could mirror my sort of quirkiness, my intellectual capacity, my sense of humor, these different sorts of characteristics. If I had a safe adult to model that I could actually grow up to be a woman that was loved and accepted for these qualities, that I would have been open to that. It's just very unfortunately, I fell through the cracks.
Mm-hmm.
There was no one at school, there was no one at college, there was no one at home. There was just no safe adult in my life that showed me that it was okay to be quirky the way that I am and still be a straight woman, and that there's actually some pros to accepting your biological sex. The way it was framed without any adult guidance or supervision, it's framed as if there's only negatives, and
Mm-hmm.
being trans is a way to enlightenment. And so, in a way, I was on the hero's journey existentially and seeking transcendence of myself, which I now advocate for strongly. But I was seeking transcendence through an illusion. So I had an illusionary false sense of transcendence through disassociation instead of the philosophy I've now embraced, which is a pro-humanist, pro-life, anti-nihilistic, radical acceptance of self.
Mm-hmm. That's that's beautifully put. I think it sounds like you were really lacking a mentor and a role model and somebody to show you your strengths and maybe work through de-emphasizing some of the fixation that you had. But I know it's hard right now to find that with therapy. You mentioned that you'd seen mental health therapists, and I know that they're right now the training really emphasizes gender affirming care so much. And the people, even the people who are willing to go against that, walk around it very carefully for the most part.
Yeah, it's really tough because I'm a big enjoyer of therapy. I've had some wonderful therapists and I have a current therapist, and so I'm definitely not against therapy, but therapy as it was traditionally, where it actually was therapeutic instead of just affirming an illusion. So it's very challenging to find a proper mentor. Not, because I like I said, I had adults in my life. My parents. I mean, I lived with my parents. I lived in their basement, of course, and they were together. They were still married, and I used their insurance plan to try to find in-network therapists and psychiatrists that worked in the gender field and that could help with that. So it's not that I wasn't seeking help. I was very desperately seeking help, but it's just that the adults that I encountered or were living with were incompetent. And the therapists that I found were, they said that they were open to gender stuff, but what I saw pretty quickly was that really meant that they were just kind of shoehorning in, when you're looking on a therapist profile and they have a million things that they work in, it's like they're just putting everything up there. And that's kind of a red flag, because they don't really have a specific model, or they're just claiming that they know all these models or whatever. That's kind of what happens. So just kind of general low quality therapy is a problem anyway. But then you throw in the gender stuff, and there's all these people that want to seem affirming or, welcoming or inclusive. So there's just like run of the mill, low quality therapists that are just saying like, yeah, I support LGBT. And then you have a young person coming in that's having very deep existential issues and that have been entrenched, compounded by complex trauma. And they're approaching with all these questions and all these, and all these beliefs that they have, as I did, and looking for help earnestly. But all the person knows is, oh, I guess I should just affirm this. So I would say the therapy that I received was shallow. It was ineffective. It was just not trauma informed at all. So that's another problem in the therapeutic industry. So yeah, I just kind of fell through the cracks.
With your perspective now, what would you like to have been different?
Oh boy. I think that the main thing that my main shtick that I talk about is attachment, is healthy attachment, is the relationship of emotional, physical, psychological closeness between you and your primary caregiver. So what I really needed was for my mother to be mirroring and emotionally available to me, which she wasn't. And I really needed my father to be mirroring and emotionally available to me and not abusive to me, which he wasn't. So that's really what I needed. Unfortunately, obviously, that wasn't in my control. And so I really needed a substitute for that, which is obviously what therapists or mentors or coaches do a lot of time is if you don't get that in your development, another person models that to you. So then you do get that eventually. So that's really what I needed. And that's what I later got at about the age of 23 or 24. That's when I found a quality therapist from GenSpect. And so I've had two quality therapists who have been able to mirror me and provide that attunement to me and mentor me. And it's very sad because I went so long and so much permanent damage happened to my brain and body. And yet it's hopeful at the same time, because as soon as I did get that safe adult, I started healing rapidly. And I moved out of my parents' basement, got away from, that environment, and have now started to thrive, in only about 4 years' time. So
That's wonderful. That's so much progress for you.
yeah, I am It's a whirlwind, but I'm very grateful to be where I'm at today.
Well, that's wonderful. And when you were about 22 and things started to shift for you, you started to open your mind about your transition. What was that like? And what were the things that sort of how did the cracks start to form in your understanding or your identity?
Well, from about 20 to 22, after I'd had my breast cut off, um, I was very disassociated. I was in survival mode. I was very suicidal. I was abusing hard drugs to cope. I was hooking up with middle-aged men from Grindr, the gay hookup app. It was very dark. It was very grim. And so I was pretty much debating for a few months. Basically, after the crack addict, the middle-aged crack addict that I was hooking up with discarded me very abruptly, and I had to kind of have a very, very painful detachment from him. I was debating, am I going to kill myself or not? And this is something I've debated for years since I was about 14.
Mm.
But I was debating it because was thinking, okay, if if I have been suicidal this long, but I haven't acted on it, maybe that stands to reason logically that I have some motivation to live or some reason to live, or that I could find a reason. So I really debated for several months. Just literally, I like took a semester off of college. All I did was basically sleep and think about these questions. And I thought, well, if I haven't killed myself by now, like it's probably not going to happen and if I keep living in this survival state without making some kind of choices or behavioral changes, then nothing's going to change. And so I decided, okay, I'm not going to kill myself.
Mm.
So let me find out what is even my reality, basically. What is my baseline reality? So I went in and I got a full psychological evaluation. They tested for pretty much everything because I was thinking that something was going to come up, something new, because things were so messed up, and it didn't feel like by that point I'd been diagnosed with depression, anxiety, PCOS, autism, gender dysphoria, and a sleep disorder.
Mm.
And those were definitely problems, but I just felt like there was something else. And so when I was diagnosed with PTSD, that was the wake up call. And I was like, oh, wow, like I really have been traumatized. I'm not just making it up, or it's not just me, because from my family, there had been immense gaslighting chronically, and victim blaming, that this was my fault and that I deserve to be abused, and
Mm.
that I'm just making things up or I'm lying about it. So I didn't really have a good sense of reality. But when I was, diagnosed with PTSD, I realized that my world just expanded
Mm.
philosophically. And that's when I started posting about it on Tumblr, just on a very small, anonymous kind of art blog or whatever I had, about having trauma. And they said that I had trauma from the transition. And then the algorithm started recommending me gender critical radical feminists posts.
Mm.
And women, I started seeing women talking about how girls transition because of internalized misogyny and abuse from men in their lives, and all these things that had been my experience. And I started to see a couple women, anonymous detransitioners on Tumblr. This would have been 2019, or 2018 or 2019. And they were, talking about very similar experiences to myself. And so I realized that, number one, I'm not alone. Like there are actually other women like me, like autistic, very gender nonconforming, androgynous. And then there are people who transition because of trauma. And then I entered a small private detrans group chat on Facebook with other women. And I was invited to a detrans women's meetup group outside of Portland, actually, called Blood and Visions. And that's when I met other women that were kind of like me for the first time. We all had really hairy legs. We were all very, out there. We're all autistic. And it was like, oh, like there's other people like me that are female. And so we were like accepting our femaleness, and we went around shirtless, and half the women had breasts and half didn't. So it was very interesting to see trans identified females, like myself, who were radically accepting their female biology and accepting that we had been abused. And so the kind of wake up moment was shifting my identity from trans gay man to abused straight woman. And the abused part was key, because I'd always been very heterosexual. I call myself super straight, but the abused part was, again, I had been conditioned to believe that I'm just bad and I deserve abuse, not that I shouldn't have been abused, So that was the key, is shifting that and accepting that trauma element that obviously is so painful and has so much grief, and just to begin to unravel the layers of disassociation from the years of abuse, allowed me to radically accept that I was a damaged female, and that the transition had damaged my female body further. And obviously in the 5 years since then, I've been expanding my identity further to now expand that into in a survivor mentality, and not a like abused woman mentality. I'm not going to like put that on a dating profile, but that was the stepping stone, is I've realized you cannot go from self-hate to self-love. That doesn't work at all. You have to go from self-hate to self-neutrality, and just accepting the baseline reality of what is, without a moral judgment if it's good or bad.
So it sounds like from a very dark place of suicidality and self-hate, as you say, you started to somehow be able to ask questions about that. And it's almost like you did your own DBT therapy there, realizing that I am here and things are bad, but I don't know if I can't live with them. Maybe I can live with them. And then through connecting with other people and starting to realize that things had been done in your life that shouldn't have been, that you had been on the receiving end of things that were wrong and that had hurt you. And then getting validation for that recognition, you found some way to connect with yourself and accept yourself and move into a new way of looking at yourself as a woman, being able to just be yourself, even if you didn't have those role models growing up, or when you were a young woman, you started to find them through peers and through social connection.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, I often try to talk about this today, that, the trans issue and the detrans issue they're just normal trauma issues. This isn't, yes, there's an element of Mengele level like medical experimentation. Okay, there's that. I'll give it that. But in most ways, it's just another maladaptive coping mechanism for trauma, and social isolation. And so if we understand that the ways that people would typically heal from any sort of trauma or abuse, peer support, going to a 12-step group, finding other people that relate to their experience, being believed for their abuse, these very typical trauma informed things, we can understand, how detransition is possible.
Yeah. And I think that the work that you're doing, putting this out there, I hope that it's helpful. I can only imagine that it's immensely helpful to people understanding what's going on with this gender crisis that we're in. Seeing people like yourself coming through this arc of identity and then kind of self-correction and finding yourself again after being really lost in that gender world.
Yeah, self-correction is a very polite way to put it. I mean, it's kind of I look at it as the phoenix cycle of life, death, and rebirth, like a alchemization of pain. Like when you have this much pain, which is a form of energy, you have this much painful energy. What can you do with it? You have to transmute it through honestly just strength and blunt force, like
Hmm.
toughness and release and crying and all these things, to then alchemize it into knowledge, into wisdom, into self-compassion, self-forgiveness, and then, you know, giving that to yourself through behavioral changes and, changing your, reprogramming your mind,
Hmm.
physically and mentally. So self-correction through transmutation, basically.
That's really beautiful. I love that. I love the Phoenix cycle reference, and I love the hero's journey as well, because it really is quite the hero's journey. You're venturing into the deepest, darkest pits and somehow fighting those demons and coming out of it stronger.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the demons, not literally. I mean, it's very symbolic, but they're
Hmm.
very real. And I think it's apt to use sort of this intense spiritual language sometimes, like
Hmm.
demons and the devil and different things like that, metaphorically,
Hmm.
because it really is these insidious forces and generational trauma, the way these demons get passed down to you and
Hmm.
you live with them and you think they're normal, and then you encounter people who don't have them or who have fought them off, and you realize that you can release them and you can purge them, or at least like overpower them. I think that's so crucial, which is why a big part of the work I do see it as modeling. So
Hmm.
that's why I'm so open about everything, because first of all, I have nothing to lose at this point. Second, I feel there's so many people that need to see someone who is doing it and who has done parts of this healing transmutation already, because otherwise they're not going to know that it's possible for themselves.
Hmm. And your art is also phenomenal. I
Oh, thank you.
when we shared a cab about a year ago, and you showed me some of the things that you've done, and I was super impressed. And did you come up with the symbol of the gecko? Was it a little gecko?
So I didn't invent the lizard symbol
Uh-huh.
as a representation of detransition, and no one really knows who did.
Hmm.
But I have helped to popularize it, and I've designed like Detrans Awareness Day merchandise and stuff that has lizards on it, and
Hmm.
but yeah, I cannot take credit for it in general.
Can you say a little bit about what that symbolism is? Because I just think it's really awesome.
Yeah, so the some lizards can lose and regrow their tails, and but their tails grow back a little bit funky, a little bit off, and but they still kind of survive and have, that regrowth, that rebirth kind of process. And so detransitioners use the lizard as a symbol of regrowth after bodily harm, and, trying to restore our bodies back to their original organic beauty. And sometimes we can't fully regrow. Like I will never have breasts again. And so again, just that radical acceptance of bodily integrity that we still have. Like I still have my fertility, which I'm very, very grateful for every day. Um, and so it's kind of a symbol of bodily healing.
I think that's wonderful and really profound and a beautiful symbol.
Yeah, it's
So,
also very cute.
yeah, it is cute for sure. And I think that's really good because there is life after. Many of us make what we end up feeling are profound mistakes when we're young and have to manage to integrate and live with the consequences of those mistakes. And in these cases, you've got doctors helping to facilitate this harm and adults stepping in and concretizing the what could have just been a phase in someone's life, and in a way that people have to manage to accept and integrate, and that can be really challenging. But I love the whimsical nature of that. I think that it's really lovely, and I think it gives a lot of hope.
Yeah, whimsy is we need more whimsy in the West. That's like a good alliteration sentence. I should
I
use
like
that.
that. I like that. Like
Yeah.
to see what art you can create with that whimsy in the
Yeah.
West. So when you're talking about trauma, that kind of brings full circle. I'm thinking about the topic that brought us to have this conversation in the first place, and it's something that I have just felt that people are not talking enough about the impact of pornography on people's relationships, on individual well-being, on sexual development through the lifespan, and really especially kids and young people who the average age that people are encountering pornography now is quite young. I've heard 9, 10 years old on average, that by 11, most kids have seen porn. And this is really shocking because we're seeing some really explicit content in many cases way before you'd have your own organic sexual experiences. And so this is kind of the first imprinting of sexuality for a lot of people who are alive today. And I know not it's not directly sexual abuse in the same way that being molested or being taken advantage of by an adult that or an older person in your life. But I feel like some of the effects of pornography consumption, especially on really young people, can have a similar imprint on someone's life. And I remember you bringing this up in a way that was like, we need to talk about the effect of porn on girls. And I'm really interested in your perspective on that and what thoughts you've had around that.
Yeah, it's a big topic. But I mean, I guess I'll start with just my own experience with porn as a kid. So, I'm on the Gen Z millennial cusp, was born in 97. So I was exposed to porn probably around, I mean, I remember using porn actively by 14. It might have been exposure earlier, like an image here or there, but basically from 14 on, I was using porn on a regular basis, searching for it myself. I want to say maybe around 12, 13, I might have started seeing it and I didn't really understand what it was, or like masturbation, like what all it was. Again, I'm very open here, but I pretty much started like masturbating when I was probably about like 5 or 6, but I didn't know what I was doing. It was just self-stimulation, and I would routinely do that. And then I sort of put it 2 and 2 together of masturbation and porn and sexuality probably by 14. And you know, in very feminine fashion, in retrospect, I was looking up like very romantic porn, when I was 14. I was looking up like couples making love to each other and stuff like that. Because I've always been a hopeless romantic person. But pretty quickly that, you're watching a video that might be, for all intents and purposes, normal, healthy relating as much as that can appear on a camera for an audience. And pretty quickly, the algorithms are recommending you anything and everything else. So pretty quickly, I then started consuming violent porn, degrading porn, misogynistic porn on a regular basis.
About what age would you say? Was that also around 14? Okay,
yeah.
wow.
Very quickly, so, and whether you've been abused or not, that's going to be just confusing. It's going to be giving you a perspective of sexuality that you're not ready for because you don't have the psychosocial maturity, or sometimes even the physical maturity to do that. And certainly for someone like me who was very socially awkward. I mean, when I was 14, I didn't have any friends. I was very isolated. I was really only friends with people on the internet. And, autistic. So I have some social delays or some social differences that inhibit my ability to relate to other people. So I wasn't dating. I wasn't doing anything with anyone. I didn't even have platonic friends. So you take a really inexperienced, naive person or kid and expose them to that, they're going to be both repulsed and curious at the same time, because that's only natural. And especially if you have deprivation socially, or like I had touch deprivation, right? Because I did not feel comfortable with certain sensory things. With the autism, I was very sensitive to touch and especially contact with other people, and especially my own family. I didn't want to be touched by my mother or father at that point. And so I had touch deprivation. And so, a lot of kids, when they have touch deprivation and they're not getting, physical intimacy that we all need, they're going to self-soothe through masturbation. They're going to self-soothe through fantasy and romantic and sexual fantasy, which isn't wrong. But when porn is up in play, you have a distorted, fantastical sense of reality with no boundaries or limitations of where lines are between healthiness and unhealthiness.
Mm-hmm.
And so porn definitely, I would say it was a coping mechanism for me for a very long time, just for the touch deprivation and the relational issues I had. I had many unrequited loves because I had very strong attachment issues and get attached to anyone who is around, basically. And most people who are around are not appropriate for us. So the odds are there's going to be some rejections. And so by the time I was 15 or 16, had graduated from just consuming porn into actively seeking out sexual encounters.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's the porn that's recommended in terms of videos and GIFs and images, but then there's the pornified culture that we have that's so easy to access online, the hookup apps and websites. So at 15, 16, I was going on Craigslist. By that time, I had made some friends through smoking weed. Weed neutralizes people. But so me and my friends would go on and Craigslist and make ads, looking for sexual encounters. We were underage.
Wow.
And, the men that would contact us were not of interest to us sexually. Let's just say. So thankfully, I didn't end up meeting up with anybody until I was actually 18, fortunately. But when you're queer questioning or non-binary or trans-identified as a teenager, there's even fewer boundaries around sexual spaces. And so, it's interesting that the trans cult often will use the line like, why do you care so much about kids' genitals? Why do you want kids to have orgasms? They invert the reality that they're the ones that are approaching children and making content geared towards kids for LGBTQ, education, sex ed. They're the ones that are making this content geared towards children to teach them about sex when really they have no business educating a strange child about sexuality. So, I was approaching it from a normal, not, let's say before I was trans identified, I was approaching it already through this, hyper pornified cultural lens. But then when the trans identity was occurring, then I started to seek out spaces talking about that, which are even more insidious because the TQ side of the alphabet soup is really a free-for-all for anyone to self-identify into that who has any interest in sexuality. And there's a lot of deviance in there. There's a lot of perverts in there. There's a lot of child predators in there. And they use that as a disguise to find victims. And we've heard this so many times, that girls and boys are on Reddit or Tumblr or Discord or TikTok or YouTube, and they're in these forums questioning their gender identity, and these older trans identifying predators will validate them, and they'll encourage pictures because in these forums you're posting, like you're posting a photo asking, do I pass? A young boy is like, oh, do I look like a woman? And then these creeps come in and they're like, oh, you look so pretty and so beautiful. And, so you're getting this attention that we're all, these kids are clearly not getting in real life, from peers or adults. And then their burgeoning sexuality is being validated, which is all developmentally normal. We need this, but it's coming from predators that are selfishly interested, for their own gratification. They're not actually having a peer relationship. Or what we see are kids that are equally sexually confused and socially awkward having relationships with each other online. And these are like two straight autistic girls or two gay boys who are dating each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, again, normal, like exploration, but they're also validating disassociation from that sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll either get a hypersexuality or a hyposexuality. The hypersexuality is going to manifest probably for those who have more narcissistic traits, like more cluster B type traits, where there's like exhibitionism and they're sensory seeking, so they're seeking sexual encounters. I would fall into this category in the past, where I was the hypersexual, using masturbation to cope, obsessed with porn, or not obsessed with porn, but obsessed with sex,
Mm-hmm.
obsessed with the male body,
Mm-hmm.
obsessed, kind of taking all of my attachment wounds and just stuffing them
Mm-hmm.
all into this romance category, which we tend to do to our detriment as human beings, especially as a teenager. You don't, you have an attachment wound to the father, the mother, you don't have friends or a boyfriend, and you're like, I just need someone to love me and someone to be there and to have sex. And it's awful because you then get an obsession with something that's really unobtainable because nobody can be that person.
Mm-hmm.
So the hypersexual ones are really at risk online because they're putting themselves out there. They're posting provocative photos. They want to show off their androgyny. They want to show off their bodies, even though they have issues with their bodies. They're coping with it in a way, that a lot of women and girls tend to do. That's how they're getting attention,
Mm-hmm.
using their bodies, but they don't have boundaries around it. Or we have the hyposexual ones. So those are the ones that are going to identify as asexual.
Mm-hmm.
And the ones that are, so overwhelmed with sexuality and everything that's going on that their disassociation is to avoid it, to ignore it, to deny it. Or they're so young that they don't even have a sexuality. And so they're like, well, I'm asexual because they're literally like a prepubescent
Mm-hmm.
child.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously that group is at risk too, because anytime you put a label on yourself, like it's very, very troubling and very sad to me whenever I see these profiles, because these kids are so innocent. They'll put in their profiles, their pronouns, and all their mental illnesses and whatever fandoms they're into. And then they'll often say their age, and they'll often say, like, I'm a minor, do not interact. So they'll have D and I listed as do
Okay.
not interact,
Mm.
or they'll say minors do not interact. But by saying that, that's actually a green flag to a predator that
Oh.
person is vulnerable and doesn't have boundaries, or that they're a child.
Mm.
And so they're trying to, protect themselves online, but it's actually signaling to unsafe adults that that person is unstable and probably easy to manipulate.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if you're saying I'm asexual, that doesn't matter to a predator. In fact, that might be more appealing to them. So
Mm-hmm.
whether you're hypersexual or hyposexual in the trans world, you're going to be very vulnerable to predation. So I know that's not exactly porn, but this is very related. I would say this
Mm-hmm.
might be even more prevalent, is the relationship in the unsafe, unboundaried, hypersexual online culture that we have right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's more prevalent to have these relational manipulations from these predators, or these I would say even naive peers that might be a couple years older. Like, let's say you have an autistic 15-year-old who is questioning their identity, and then you have an autistic 21-year-old who is also developmentally delayed, but they're a little older. So then they're educating or helping that younger kid, avoid their parents or get
Mm-hmm.
DIY hormones or teach them about sex. That 21-year-old might not be a predator, but in fact, they're enabling predators and they're inadvertently grooming that person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I'll stop talking and just see where you're at right now.
No, well, that's an incredible amount of insight. There's so many different directions we could go just off of what you've just shared. I'm thinking about what you said kind of early on in that description, and you're talking about when you were 14 and you started to access porn, you would have it would have been around 2011, I suppose, right? You were born in
Yes.
97. And I think that the online streaming sites like Pornhub really came into being around 2005 to 2008. So prior to that, there'd been people had had magazines forever. People could rent a video at the video store, but there wasn't the proliferation of content so easy to access that we have now. And that's it started when you were just a kid. And so by the time you were sort of you had sex drive kicking in and curiosity, what you were able to access in order to satisfy your curiosity or in order to you know, to explore this interest or this burgeoning, drive that you had was of a totally different quality than what it would have been 10 years prior if you had been 10 years older. And one of the things that's really alarming about that is even though you were specifically seeking out what sounds like pretty vanilla stuff, not that that's
Initially.
good for a kid to be looking at either. I don't think that that's healthy for a kid to be looking at, but it sounds like your intention was, well, I'm kind of, I just want to see sex. Just show me a couple. And then you started to be served up some violent stuff really early. You said you were still 14 years old and you're starting to pretty quickly see things that are misogynistic, violent, abusive. And that, I guess that just it horrifies me to think of just a kid sitting there suddenly seeing this. And I know there's statistics on how many young women now, like Gen Z women, experience choking at the hands of a partner or other kinds of sexual violence that they don't initiate, that is initiated by a partner against them. This is almost unheard of for someone my age. In older generations, we just wouldn't have had that be a big part of our normal interactions with a romantic partner. That would have been some specific kink that you're into, or I don't even know. It wasn't a thing that was even talked about, and now it's so prevalent. And I don't know. I guess I don't really have a question about that so much as just I'm just going, oh my God, that
Think that's the
you're seeing
correct
that so young.
response. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, sometimes the first step is just like, holy shit, that's messed up. And
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's very interesting to be older now and to have a fully formed brain, which I love having it. I could have used it a while before.
Yeah.
Um, but then to talk to older people of different generations, like I have a lot of Gen X friends because I talk to a lot of parents, and my best friends are actually Gen X. I love Gen X because I share their music tastes. But um, so, but the way they speak about it is just like, I know that there were always problems. There were always, women always had similar problems, like men not wanting to commit, or men had certain problems, like women, being trying to baby trap them or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
But man, those problems seem so appealing. Like I'm nostalgic for a time when I wasn't alive because there was at least some semblance of like courtship rituals. There was
Yeah.
some semblance of dating norms. There was some semblance of like when you mentioned in the past you used to have magazines and videos, like a thought occurred to me, like in a way there was more sacredness around it, and we might not think of like jerking off to a Hustler magazine as a sacred act, but I was just thinking like how in video stores you'd have a special room
Mm-hmm.
with to go in and get a porn video, and there's almost like a sacredness because there's a certain level of respect that is separate from everything else, that all the other videos that you rent are not going to be eroticized in that way, or they're not going to be for sexual gratification purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe sacred isn't, I think, okay, so I think sacred is an appropriate term to apply because I do think we've lost the sacredness around sex. We've
Mm-hmm.
lost the sacredness around masculinity and femininity and a divine union, and I don't mean that in a religious sense. I just mean that in a existential, beautiful sense of the universe. But there's also this at least respect
Hmm.
for sexuality in a way that we don't have anymore in the culture. um the pornification of ads, the pornification of online games. Like, it might go to we go to our spam folders in our email, and there's like 50 porn ads. We just have to deal with that. And we can't escape porn. We can't escape sexual advertising, even if we're not directly looking at or recommended porn.
Mm.
We see it in our culture. We see it in TV and film, and there's just not, many movies and TV shows will just have a gratuitous sex scene, where it's just like you have to have it,
Hmm.
instead of having a real artistic purpose, or like a plot narrative device for why that would be in there, or it's filmed in an artistic way that has some kind of respect.
Hmm.
And again, like, this doesn't need to be black or white, like kind of puritanical, prudish, like religious sense, to just have a normal respect for the male body and the female body. And honestly, I don't really know where we go from here, besides just having awareness and boundaries around it, because it's just so proliferated in our entire media diet.
Hmm. I think you're pointing out something really important, that that sense of boundarylessness when it comes to sexuality. It's like everything is, the lines are blurring, and especially as you say in this like LGBTQIA plus, whatever all the acronyms are now, there is sort of a folding in of sex with all of the identity stuff. That's kind of like everything is open now. We should be able to talk about this with very young kids. We should normalize that everybody's looking at porn. And I'm somebody who's looked at very little porn in my life. I have always had a sense that it was not right for me to look at it. It felt wrong. So my my experience of that has been, I'm relatively naive to it. Relatively. I mean, I've seen some. The first time I saw a porn video would have been when I was in probably middle school or high school, and it was at a friend's house, and she put one in, and all of us girls just kind of dissolved into laughter. It was just like, oh my God, it was some ridiculousness. But so it's not like I haven't been exposed to it, but I was also much older by the time there was online streaming porn, and it just felt yucky and wrong to me. So I haven't searched it up. I don't have like some web history where somebody has my Google connected to a porn, but I still come across it. Like I just had to I found out just a couple days ago that there's a setting on Twitter or X that allows you to stop the auto scroll, because now it forwards you to the next video automatically if you don't click a certain setting. My auto scroll was popping porn into my feeds. So I would look at a normal video that I agreed to look at, that was somebody posted it and I want to watch this thing. And then the next thing would be pornography. And it's just like you said, it's kind of everywhere. And I think for kids, like you're describing in your youth, feeling like you were touch deprived, you were lonely, you were not connecting well with people in real life, you weren't connecting well with your family, you didn't have a lot of social resources around you. So you're doing a lot of your socializing online. So you're spending a lot of time on the computer. And if this stuff is just so easy to come across, you're lonely, plus you have a brand new big sex drive because you're an adolescent, and that's what people are supposed to be like when they're adolescents. This is a recipe for following your curiosity down the rabbit hole. And I think it's just happening over and over and over. I had a conversation with a guy of several months back, maybe 6 months or so back, named Noah Church, and he described his first accessing porn similarly to yourself, just very young, quickly fell down the rabbit hole. He's a recovering porn addict, and he does coaching for men especially, but I think women too. But he helps people to recover now. That's something he's made a profession out of. And that story is more and more frequently we're hearing more and more people say, I was addicted or I am addicted. I need help to stop this thing that I feel like I compulsively go to. And I can't help but wonder what would it be like to be a young girl coming across this content. Like I came of age before we had Instagram. So there wasn't this proliferation of perfect looking Instagram models for me to compare my awkward teenage self to. I didn't have to constantly look at my own face in a selfie camera to try to see if I was pretty enough. And I think it would have been horrible for my mental health if that had existed. And pornography just takes that whole thing and kicks it a level up, because then you look at these beautiful women. You're never going to be as beautiful as these women. And so you're not enough. But also look at what's happening to these women. And I don't know if I'm strangely excited by it, but I also am repulsed by it at the same time. What a toxic soup to be swimming in as a young person.
Yeah, you say, well, I mean, I feel like let's put it this way. The porn that I was exposed to at 14 is still the stuff that turns me on today.
Mm-hmm.
Not everything.
It imprints.
But it got wired that way.
Mm-hmm.
And now it is what it is. And I'm an adult and I can make good choices or bad choices, right? It's mm-hmm. up to me to protect myself now.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what turns me on. And sometimes I think, why this? And I'm like, oh, it's just because it just was my brain was wired that way through association, repeated exposure. And you can always rewire the brain, but when it's rewired at that age, especially when I had abuse also wired at my brain, like I would say the age where I was probably most abused was 12 to 14.
Gosh.
So that
you're in a very plastic state.
Yes. And, especially when you have had abuse, the porn, you have a different relationship to the porn too, because you have a tolerance for pain and suffering, and in some sense, a masochistic quality, especially for women who are internalize their pain more than externalize it. So when you're watching this violent porn, you're relating to it maybe even more than someone who hadn't been abused had related to it, and it turns you on more because it's more familiar, it's more comfortable, and so it's even more treacherous because you see yourself in it, and you identify with it, and then it's very sometimes I jokingly like to thank my depression for being so strong, because I had so little motivation to get my shit together to actually go out and do these things.
Oh, wow. Like, yeah.
My depression and my social, what's the term? Incompetency, protected me from actually
putting into action.
I wasn't like a hot young girl who was like going out and doing these things. I was too messed up to do that, which has its own set of problems. But in some sense, I'm like, okay, like I was protected from acting it out. Although I did have many hookups. I'm actually surprised that I was never assaulted. I'm truly surprised, because there was a lot of them and I was never sober for any of them. And that was from 18 to 22.
The whole time you were identifying as trans, your primary identification.
Yeah. And so that's another thing. Like, not only are you exposed to these things during your most plastic state, but then there's a sense of grief that I have, because my youth and development were wasted on this fantasy. Like, I was wasting some of my most youthful years where I should have been, dating and exploring and meeting developmental milestones that I'm just now meeting in some ways, like 10 years later. There's just developmental delays that happen because you're living in a fantasy. And so I'm very angry that for that time that I wasted, thinking that I was a gay man, and all the pain and heartbreak that I had and unrequited loves that I
Mm,
had, when I could have been having unrequited loves for straight men,
mhm.
as I later did. Um, but I guess like maybe now is a good time to discuss that the aspect of gay porn
Mm.
on women,
Okay.
um, because that's crucial to understanding the trans ideology in the current cohort, because most of them are heterosexual and a lot of them are identifying as gay boys.
Hmm.
So for me, I didn't identify as a man, I identified as a gay man. And to me, those were
Specifically.
very different things
Wow.
because, I had been abused by a straight man, my father,
Hmm.
and masculinity, in the woke paradigm is toxic and it's evil,
Hmm.
and there's the
Hmm.
patriarchy, and also, I have to admit, as a kind of a smart, quirky, funny young girl, like a lot of boys my age or even older were just not doing it for me.
Hmm.
And there wasn't much compatibility there.
Hmm.
So at that age, straight boys, they're just not meeting you where you're at
Yeah.
sometimes. And if you don't have male role models to teach you, oh, men will mature, or here's how you date
Hmm.
healthily.
Hmm.
Obviously, for me, that was the opposite. You're going to feel very frustrated sexually, and you're going to feel confused romantically, and when you're very lonely and longing for connection, you're going to see like, who can I connect with, who is easily available. As Michael Scott says, desperate situations yield the quickest results. The same with attachment. So if you get attached to whoever's around, yeah, you might have like a quick sort of intense, dopamine
Mm.
hit or oxytocin hit, but then in the long term, that person's not really going to be appropriate for you. So that's what happened to me with the gay guys. Like,
Mm.
I had such attachment wounds and identity crisis that I wasn't really connecting with other girls, and not with straight boys either romantically. So the people that I did connect with as a teenager were gay boys.
Mm.
There's obviously a very loving and beautiful relationship that straight women and gay men have with each other. And I don't think all of the aspects of those relationships that I had were negative.
Mhm.
But they ultimately ended up being very traumatic for me because I truly didn't understand why they didn't love me in return. I
Mm.
truly could not accept that it wasn't my fault that
Mhm.
they were sexually rejecting me, because we were cuddling, we were holding hands, we were best friends, and yet they wouldn't go all the way.
Mhm.
And with my codependency and attachment wounds, was like, I was devastated by this. And that's when the symptoms of my gender issues and my self-hatred of my genitalia really coalesced. And this was
Mhm.
around 16, 17. I had a year's worth of unrequited loves for three different gay boys, friends
Mm.
of mine. And it was just absolutely horrible because we were all believing the ideology that, we were non-binary and that sex didn't matter and genitals didn't matter, but they did. They did
Mm.
matter when it came to me wanting to have sex with them and them not to want to have sex with me.
Mhm.
And so we can have this fantasy all we want that men and women are the same, and you don't label things or whatever, but we actually do need labels and to understand sex differences, because when you're trying to actually be productive in the world, you run into these kind of snags,
Mhm.
like a gay man not wanting to have sex with me. Um, and so that's an enormous part, I think, of what happens um, with these girls that are, disconnected from womanhood, and they're non-conforming, so they are more fluid and open to, gender fluidity and androgyny and whatever, but they're heterosexual. So they adopt this gay male fantasy because it seems safer. The gay male fantasy in my mind was, I can be funny, I can be horny, I can be, flamboyant, I can be artistic, I can be weird, whatever I want, but still love and be loved by men under this gay masculine label. Versus as a straight woman, right? That goes back to my later realization, like, I'm an abused, damaged girl who's unhealthy, an abused, damaged straight girl. And obviously, I had disdain or just dislike or fear of straight men. So gay masculinity seemed this fantasy. Now,
Mhm.
I've obviously spoken to gay men and now have adult gay male friends that are like, it's not all that's cracked up to be, Laura. Like, you want to find like love making in the gay male community. Good luck to you.
Oh gosh, yeah.
So it's like, it's this, it's very sad. It's this, sort of innocent young girl fantasy of finding love
Hmm.
and then you adopt this fantasy of that happening. Like, I viewed gay men as like maybe they could be equals. Like, okay, we have the same body parts. It's kind of autistic, isn't it?
Hmm.
Okay, we have the same body parts. We have the same, sex drive to each other. And, our bodies are more similar. And so maybe it could be equal and we'll then have a reciprocal relationship. And obviously, I've learned since that men and women are complements of each other. They're not identical because they're
Hmm.
not meant to be identical. And you can still have a reciprocal, equal relationship. But as an abused girl, all I saw was power imbalance. And the woke ideology teaches that everything is through the lens of power. And so you're seeing, when people are saying like intercourse is inherently misogynistic because there's a man's penis entering a woman's vagina, and
Hmm.
that's a power dynamic. And it's like, that kind of those ideas. And then the idea is that, oh, well, if we just call ourselves non binary, then we're the same, that really, really harmed me. And I think that happens to a lot of these girls. So then they start watching gay male porn and engaging in gay male spaces where it's not safe and they're not meant to be there, like Grinder or forums online,
Hmm.
or they are indulging each other's fantasies sexually, writing fan fiction, watching, anime porn called yaoi. And I was never into anime, but I was very much into this. Like in fandoms, you tend to ship people together. You want
Hmm.
them to have a romantic relationship. And so there's all these teenage girls that are fangirling over their favorite celebrities. And I'm not blaming them for that. I have done that. That's how I survived. I had parasocial relationships with old male rock stars. Like, of course
Hmm.
I'm going to do that. But then these girls today, they're writing all this fan fiction about them having gay relationships,
Hmm.
gay. And
Hmm.
they're drawing these very cutesy, like they'll draw these like heterosexual male characters, like actors or in TV shows or whatever, or bands in these cutesy like outfits and like cute couple stuff that's very clearly like a female is doing this.
Hmm.
It's very emotional, it's
Hmm.
very relational. Like the the trans identified male teens aren't doing that.
Hmm.
They're on these forums, trying to find, they're looking at like memes and sexual memes and political memes, and they're not really writing fan fiction, but they're looking at porn produced by older male trans identified, whether they be AGPs or transsexuals. Um, this porn produced by them in this toxic sort of way that's they're getting messages that their masculinity is defective, and they're getting um, attention and reassurance that their masculinity is gross because
Hmm.
they're posting photos of themselves, and their peers and older predators are commenting. And it's very similar to the eating disorder community online,
Hmm.
where you're helping each other monitor your weight loss. So it's like, oh yeah, my estrogen is really, my breasts are budding, and then you'll get a bunch of congratulations, like, oh, you're looking so, and these older men are grooming them,
Hmm.
but they're also grooming each other
Hmm.
inadvertently. And again, a lot of them are straight, but it could be a straight or gay girl or boy doing this. I do think today we're seeing mostly heterosexual girls and boys doing it. Um, and so yeah, it's just the gay male fantasy and then the lesbian fantasy for these boys is similar, right? You're not having romantic or sexual success. In ev psych, we might call it the sneaky fucker method. Like, and a lot of these kids are too naive to maybe know that. In
Hmm.
retrospect, though, that's exactly what I was doing. I'm
Right.
like, okay, I'm not having success in this mating market,
Yeah.
so I'm gonna just try this other one. And the the unfortunate thing is in the gay male mating market, the
Mm-hmm.
hookup market, on Grindr, you can easily find hookups, like really
Mm-hmm.
easily. Like once in a blue moon, I'll have an intrusive thought. I'm like, what if just like hooked up? I could easily hook up with someone right now, like from Grindr. Obviously, I never do that and
Mm-hmm.
haven't used Grindr for years, but I still I used it so much because I could just go on there, and there was just men that were, DTF, like down to fuck, like
Mm-hmm.
any time, any
Mm-hmm.
and so now we see reports of straight men purposely going on Grindr to find vulnerable women that are using Grindr, because
Mm-hmm.
obviously gay men aren't really having sex with women on there. And
Mm-hmm.
the men that I had sex with were clearly bisexual or just sexually confused,
Mm-hmm.
which is really damaging to relationships. I don't think I need to state that enough.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but now straight men are just going on there, and think about it, like a woman like me is the perfect prey. That's why, again, I'm surprised I was never assaulted. Um, because, you just have this confused young woman who's overtly signaling, I'm unstable. I don't have a good sense of self. I'm not even accepting my own genitalia. I hate my body. And I'm sexually available,
Mm-hmm.
very sexually available and insecure about it. So to a predatory straight guy, oh man, they're gonna love that. So
Yeah.
they're just purposely going on there now to hunt for women like I used to be.
Yeah, these themes that you're bringing up, the theme of fantasy around same-sex relationships that are actually the opposite sex to yourself, the ease of access of sexual hookups. I mean, these things are, I think they're very uncomfortable for a lot of people to think about, but they're also really prevalent themes that I hear all the time when I talk with younger people. And I think that, again, it kind of this generational thing. There's people who are older, like, I don't know, late 30s and 40s, that kind of have no idea that this is going on and that that these things are so culturally prevalent among younger people. There's this sort of understanding that people in the younger generations have around a lot of this internet-based culture, which does bleed into real life in some significant ways, that I think it's so important to talk about. And I'm glad you're shining a light on it. And it's interesting also how in your story, it's really painful and poignant. And I kind of want to just find younger you and give her a hug. This kind of theme of lack of attachment, lack of connection, leading to a rejection and a denial of self. And the only way that you're able to access the self is through putting on a mask and wearing sort of an identity and a costume in order to free you to go ahead and act in the world. But then really longing for connection where somebody can see the self through all of that. Now, just what a torturous process for you to have gone through.
Yeah, that's it's I have a lot of grief around that.
Mm.
And I'm only 27. Oh, sorry, I thought I found my phone here. Um um so yeah, I'm only back to my grief. um so I mean, in all seriousness, I can't actually describe the amount of pain that I live in on a daily basis.
Mm.
And I cope with humor a lot, obviously.
I
And
was going to say your humor is an amazing source of resilience.
yeah,
So you have this really clever wit.
thank you. I was thinking, like, because there's a lot of people that are still stuck, and even my own family they're all unavailable. I'm no contact with half of them and low contact with the other half.
Mm.
So and I've thought, like, how have I gotten through? And I think the sense of humor is not to be underestimated, but it's also, I think it's also back to the social contagion aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Like, girls that are my archetype going through this, presenting in therapy, they're very much like me, right? They're hyperverbal, they're funny, they're intellectual, and so they seem like they know what they're talking about, or they seem like they're not in pain.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened with me is, if I'm acting like this, now I wasn't as confident, and obviously I think I am speaking like truth and wisdom today versus in the past. I was delusional. But to a clinician who doesn't know anything, who was trained to affirm, you're hearing a smart,
Mm-hmm.
like, it's so gross. But my surgeon, in his notes, he described me as Laura is a very pleasant 20-year-old young woman. And I'm just like, you know what? I
Wow.
probably was. But just because I was pleasant doesn't mean that I wasn't suicidal.
Right.
Um, and I think a lot of these girls fall through the cracks because they are smart and they're charming and they're funny. But also, I wasn't showering on a regular basis. And
Mm-hmm.
also, I had a lot of trauma, and no
Mm-hmm.
one, and obviously, any good therapist is going to see someone like me. Like if I presented like I am right now, like in a therapy session, my
Mm-hmm.
therapist is going to be like, all right, stop intellectualizing like what's actually
Mm-hmm.
going on. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I welcome that because I'm very aware of these tendencies. But we don't have good therapists right now. We don't have good therapists that are like, just because this person on the surface appears like they know what they're talking about, there's always something unconscious going on. Otherwise, they wouldn't be wanting to cut off their body parts. Like
Yeah.
it's just ludicrous.
Yeah. Yeah. Really well said. Laura, I really enjoy talking with you, and I feel like there's so much more we could talk about, and at the same time you've shared so deeply that I'll be fully prepared for you to email me in a couple of days and say, "Wait, scratch that." And I'll totally scratch it because it's so deep. It's such a vulnerable um exposition of self, and it's also it's a story that encapsulates so many aspects of what a lot of young people have been going through and gives a window into the universality of some of those experiences through the specific story of your own life and this process for you. But if you tell me, wait, I think I overshared, I will take it down. It's all up to you how comfortable you are sharing these deep personal details. And
Well,
yeah.
Leslie, I'll say I have an entire memoir about this that's coming out next
Uh,
year, so I wouldn't be worried.
so
I
this
don't
is
think
just
I've
a
shared
teaser.
anything. Yeah, this is just it. This is just
Uh,
an advertisement for the trauma that to come, in
oh.
written form.
Well, do you feel like there's anything that should be capped off? Do you want to say a little bit more about anything or anything important that we didn't get to that we should have?
Man, I mean, I knew when we approached this conversation that we couldn't possibly get to everything. I
I
mean, it's
know.
just so dense. I'd be happy to have a conversation about this or anything else anytime. But I don't know. We covered a lot
Yeah,
today,
we
and I think
did.
that might be enough for the people right now.
All right. Well, that's good. Well, do you want to tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, so I mostly hang out on Twitter, Laura Becker Real. I also have a YouTube channel where I have more podcasts, kind of talking about this stuff, and I also have a Substack. So you can check me out there for my writing, and stay tuned for my book, Surviving the Trans Myth, which will come out sometime in 2025.
Excellent. Awesome. I'll put all the links that you provide me in the description under this video. And thank you so much for your time today, Laura, and for sharing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leslie.